Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, March 21st, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today: Putin and Xi to discuss China's peace plan for Ukraine. So, Russian President Vladimir Putin welcomed Chinese President Xi Jinping to Moscow on Monday and said that they would discuss a 12-point peace plan that was put forward by Beijing. So Putin told Xi, quote, "We have thoroughly studied your proposals for resolving the acute crisis in Ukraine. Of course, we will have an opportunity to discuss this," end quote. Putin added that Russia is always open to negotiations. So Xi will be in Moscow until Wednesday, and he is expected to hold virtual talks with Zelensky following his meetings with Putin. Ahead of his arrival in Moscow, Xi called for a rational way out of the Ukraine conflict in an op ed for a Russian newspaper that's published by the Russian government. Xi said in the op ed that China's 12-point peace plan, which calls for an end to hostilities and the resumption of peace talks, could be the basis for the discussions to end the war. She said, quote, "The document serves as a constructive factor in neutralizing the consequences of the crisis and promoting a political settlement. Complex problems do not have simple solutions," end quote. So he's recognizing there that, it's not going to be easy bringing an end to this war. So the Biden administration, of course, has come out very strongly against Chinese efforts to mediate a ceasefire. On Friday, John Kirby, spokesman for the National Security Council, said that the administration does not support calls for a ceasefire. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, our top diplomat, he doubled down on this position on Monday, saying that the US and the world must not be fooled by China's peace plan. The talking point coming from Blinken and the other Biden administration officials is that a pause in fighting could solidify Russian territorial gains. So Blinken said, quote, "Calling for a ceasefire that does not include the removal of Russian forces from Ukrainian territory would effectively be supporting the ratification of the Russian conquest. The world should not be fooled by any tactical move by Russia supported by China or any other country to freeze the war on its own terms," end quote. And, he also said that if they pause the fighting, it's going to give Russia a chance to regroup and rebuild their forces. But it would give Ukraine the same opportunity as well, because as we know from, this, what Ukrainian soldiers are telling the media, the people that are actually there fighting and being thrown into this Bakhmut meat grinder, is that they're very unprepared. Conscripts are being thrown in with very little training. They don't have many weapons, don't have much ammunition. So it sounds like a break in fighting might actually be good for the Ukrainian side as well. But of course, the Biden administration doesn't want that. They want this fight and all this killing to keep going. And this position follows a pattern of the US and its allies discouraging peace talks throughout the conflict. And, they always say nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. But a big point on this China plan is that when China first released this 12-point peace plan, Zelensky expressed an openness to it. Of course, he had some criticism, but he said he was happy that China was taking this initiative. And he said, "I want to meet with President Xi." And now it sounds like Xi is going to give him a call after he meets with Putin. So maybe Zelensky is interested in some Chinese efforts to mediate here. But nope, President Biden right away immediately rejected it. So it just goes to show that all that nothing without Ukraine, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine is just nonsense. And the U.S. just has their own ideas about how this war is going to go. All right, the next one here. The U.S. announces a $350 million weapons package for Ukraine. And this was on Monday that this was announced. It includes ammunition for the HIMARS rocket launchers, artillery rounds, and high-speed anti-radiation missiles. Those are the HARMs. And the arms are being sent to Ukraine via the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows President Biden to ship Kiev weapons and equipment directly from Pentagon stockpiles. The funds are being pulled from that $45 billion aid package that Congress passed back in December. So they're still using that. And up to this point, Congress has authorized $113 billion in spending on the war in Ukraine. So, according to the Pentagon, they put out the list of the full aid package. It includes the HIMARS ammunition, 155 millimeter artillery rounds, 25 millimeter ammunition, the HARM missiles, 81 millimeter and 60 millimeter mortar systems and rounds, anti armor weapon systems, grenade launchers, and other small arms, demolition munitions, mine clearing equipment, heavy fuel tankers, thermal imagery systems, patrol boats, testing and diagnostic equipment for vehicle maintenance, and spare parts and other field equipment. So the Pentagon also released a fact sheet on Monday that said the U.S. has pledged over $32.5 billion in military equipment for Ukraine since Russia launched its invasion on February 24th, 2022. And this new package, it comes after a Pentagon official told the New York Times that these upcoming ammunition shipments from the U.S. and its allies were part of a last-ditch effort to help Ukraine on the battlefield, as Ukrainian forces are using artillery rounds at an unsustainable rate. According to the fact sheet, the U.S. has pledged over 1.5 million 155 millimeter artillery rounds for Ukraine. And of course, this policy has depleted Western military stockpiles, as NATO's Secretary General Stoltenberg has acknowledged. They can't produce nearly as much ammunition as Ukraine is using. Now, also on Monday, the EU announced a plan to provide Ukraine with a lot more artillery. They're going to give them 1 million shells over the next year. This is going to cost the EU more than $2 billion. And EU members, they're going to get these rounds from their own stockpiles and also jointly produce more. But to show you how much Ukraine needs, they were asking the EU, saying that they need 350,000 shells per month. Just per month, if they want a chance of beating Russia. So what is that? That's 1 million shells in 3 months. So again, it just shows a huge, this artillery war that these NATO countries were not ready to support. Excuse me. All right, the next one here. Taiwan's former president plans a historic visit to China. So this is former Taiwanese President Ma Ying-jeou. He will lead a delegation to mainland China next week in an effort to improve cross-strait relations, as tensions are soaring in the region, of course. And this will be a very historic trip. No Taiwanese president, whether former or sitting, has visited China since Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang forces fled to Taiwan in 1949, following their defeat in the Civil War against the Communist Party of China. So this is a significant move here. So, the Kuomintang was Chiang's party, but today the KMT, they are the main opposition party, and they favor friendlier relations with Beijing than the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP. So the DPP and the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, have taken steps to significantly boost ties with the U.S., resulting in more Chinese military pressure on the island. And this is making a conflict seem much more likely. So Ma, the former president, he was president from 2008 to 2016, and he's still a senior leader in the KMT, the Kuomintang. So Hsiao Hsu-sen, who is the executive director of Ma's foundation, said that there should be more exchanges between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. So this is somebody that represents former President Ma, and this is what they had to say. Quote, instead of buying more weapons, it would be better to increase exchanges between young people of the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. The more they are able to promote their friendship, the less risk there will be, end quote. So he said that Ma believes that the DPP's policies will only increase the chance of war, and his visit will focus on fostering exchanges between young people and paying tribute to his ancestors. So, of course, the DPP has slammed Ma for his plans to visit the mainland. This is a DPP spokesman who said, quote, former President Ma totally ignores the fact that the Chinese communists have continued to ramp up pressure against us, including intensifying military threats and isolating us internationally, end quote. So Ma's itinerary does not include a visit to Beijing. He has no plans to meet with high-level Chinese officials, but he has not ruled out meeting with local Chinese officials. He's going to be in China for 12 days, starting on March 27th, and he's going to lead a delegation of mostly students and some former officials. So this is, I think, a good sign because Taiwan's next presidential election will be held in January 2024. And of course, the outcome of those elections are going to have a major impact on U.S. Taiwan relations and just the situation over there in general. As a KMT victory would likely mean Taipei would be looking for better relations with Beijing. I think it's pretty clear. The Kuomintang sent a delegation to China a few weeks ago. They welcomed some Chinese officials in Taiwan, and now we have the former president, who's still a member of the party, going over there, in a historic trip. So I think, if the Kuomintang win this thing, tensions could be reduced pretty significantly, I think, across the Taiwan Strait. So the next one here, Taiwan's military shelves a law to criminalize spreading rumors. So I went over this a few weeks ago that Taiwan's military proposed amendments to a mobilization law that Taiwan has that would put government controls on media and criminalize spreading rumors. So it looks like they've backed down on it because of the backlash. And Taiwan's military has agreed to temporarily put on hold controversial proposed amendments to this law. So the changes, this law, it's called the All-Out Defense Mobilization Readiness Act. And the defense ministries, the Taiwan's defense ministries proposed amendments would give government control of all the media when Taiwan is mobilized for conflict. It would punish spreading rumors or disinformation, whatever they deem disinformation, during wartime, with up to 3 years in prison or a $32,000 fine. So a pretty significant punishment. And the amendment caused a lot of backlash, and it drew comparisons to the time when Taiwan was under martial law from 1949 to 1987, known as the White Terror period. During that time, Taiwan had a secret police known as the Taiwan Garrison Command that was responsible for silencing dissent and secret executions. Another aspect of the amendment would require education authorities to provide a list of students aged 16 and up, raising concern among parents that their children could be drafted. That's pretty young. They want to know where all the 16-year-olds are. It's definitely not a good sign. And the proposal came after Tsai Ing-wen extended Taiwan's compulsory military service from 4 months to 1 year. And that's going to take effect in 2024. So they think so Tsai isn't running. This is her second term. They have a 2-term limit in Taiwan. Her vice president is running, whose name I'm blanking out on here. But I think extending this draft and things like that, and just the situation right now in Taiwan with all the tensions with China, I think is going to give the Kuomintang a pretty good chance for these elections. And members of the Kuomintang, they said that this law, they're very against this law, and they said that due to some vague definitions in it, that the DPP could take advantage of it to consolidate power and, to use some of these authorities even when they're not technically in wartime. All right. So the next one here is pretty concerning. The U.S. gave India unprecedented intelligence during a border clash with Chinese troops. So this is according to a report from U.S. News, and it says that the U.S. gave this intelligence to India during a clash between Indian and Chinese troops in December 2022 along the disputed border high up in the Himalayas, known as the Line of Actual Control. So the report cites current and former U.S. officials who said that the intelligence sharing was possible thanks to a military pact that Washington and New Delhi signed in 2020, known as the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement, or the BECA, or BECA, I think they call it. So the deal was inked following deadly clashes between Chinese and Indian troops along the LAC in the Galwan Valley that killed 20 Indian soldiers and at least 4 Chinese troops. So if you remember that was a pretty big deal. That was the deadliest clash between the Indian and Chinese militaries, I believe, in decades. And I don't know much about this part of the world, but it's up in the Himalayas and in the Kashmir region, and there's disputed borders between India and China, India and Pakistan, of course, Pakistan and China. And if you're looking at the video here, you can see the map. And these red circles are where the 2020 clashes occurred, because it wasn't just the one where, a lot of people were killed, but the northernmost red circle is where the Galwan Valley clashes happened. So now Chinese and Indian troops, they have an agreement that they're not armed with weapons. Well, they're not armed with guns or deadly weapons, I should say, when they're deployed along this disputed border. So these clashes don't, get out of control. So, that battle, when 20 Indian soldiers were killed, they were using, bats and clubs with spikes in them, and they were fist fighting. I think a lot of the people that died fell because they're up on these cliffs, and so really brutal fight there. But thankfully, it's a good thing that they're not armed, because think about how many people would have been dead if they had guns. So that was the 2020 clashes. Now there's been some sporadic ones since then, and this one in December 2022, there were no deaths, but dozens of injuries were reported. And according to U.S. News, so again, this is the U.S. side of it. They're saying that the U.S. provided India with real-time details of China's positions and its force strength ahead of the clashes, which the sources say that these clashes were sparked by a Chinese military incursion. And when these fights break out, the two sides blame each other. Generally, it's tough to really know what happened here. But they're saying that Indian troops maneuvered to intercept the Chinese forces. And the information included satellite imagery and was more detailed and delivered faster than anything provided by the U.S. in the past. So here we have the U.S. Helping India in a battle against China. Again, good thing they're not armed with guns, but still, I mean, this is a pretty big deal. And this one source told U.S. News, quote, "They were waiting, and that's because the U.S. had given India everything to be fully prepared for this. It demonstrates a test case of the success of how the two militaries are now cooperating and sharing intelligence," end quote. And it looks like these clashes might have been provoked by joint U.S. and Indian military drills that were conducted days before. So this was at the end of November 2022 into December. The U.S. was up in this region conducting drills 60 miles away from this line of actual control, conducting drills with Indian forces just a few days before these clashes. And China spoke out against them and said that they were a violation of border agreements signed between Beijing and New Delhi in 93 and in 1996. And while the U.S. Army unit that was deployed to the Himalayas, while they were there, they did a few public things. They had a promotion ceremony in view of the Nanda Devi, which is the second tallest mountain in India. This was made public. They tweeted about it. They released pictures. And they also held a rock concert that soldiers performed in. And both events, again, published, tweeted out, posted on social media. And now this U.S. News report says that, these U.S. officials that are the sources for this story said that these events appeared to be designed to anger China. So, that could be the reason for the clashes, is what the U.S. was up to over there. So while the ties between the U.S. and China, between the U.S. and India, they fractured a bit over India's relationship with Russia, but the close military cooperation continues as the U.S. views India as a useful ally against China. India is a member of the Quad, which is sort of an informal military grouping. It's not quite an alliance. It was revived by the Trump administration, and hawks in Washington view the Quad as a potential foundation for an anti-China NATO-style alliance in Asia. So the Quad is the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia. Since Trump revived it, because it first formed, I think, in 2007, but then Australia and India got cold feet. They didn't want China to get the wrong idea about it, so they pulled out. Then I think in 2017, Trump brought it back. In 2020, they started doing joint military exercises again, and those have continued. And again, they really see this as a potential, new NATO over in the Asia Pacific. All right, so the next one here, China and Cambodia hold their first ever joint naval drills. So China and Cambodia, they've launched their first ever joint naval drills as these two Asian nations are forging stronger ties despite objections from the U.S. So the drills are named the China-Cambodia Golden Dragon 2023. They began on March 20th, and they will be held through April 8th. About 3,000 military personnel from both nations will participate. So last year, this comes a year after the Chinese and Cambodian militaries, they signed a memorandum of understanding to boost cooperation. Officials said at the time that the future cooperation would include military exercises, training, and other exchanges. And this military agreement, it came after the Biden administration put sanctions on Cambodia over its relationship with China. So the US sanctioned two Cambodian officials in 2021 due to Chinese construction at the Ream naval base in Cambodia. The US claims that this construction is going to lead to a Chinese naval base in Cambodia. China only has the one overseas base in Djibouti, but the US is always saying that they're planning to build more, which they could be, but Cambodia denies that that's going to happen. They say that they don't allow any countries to build military bases on their territory. And because of all this relationship with China, the U.S. later imposed an arms embargo on Cambodia, and that includes export controls. But this pressure has not deterred Phnom Penh from moving closer to Beijing. And Cambodia is one of the Southeast Asian countries, members of the Association of the Southeast Asian Nations, that have found themselves at the center of this new Cold War between the U.S. and China. And for Cambodia, they don't have claims to the South China Sea. China has huge investments in Cambodia. It's pretty natural for them to, if they're going to be forced to pick a side, they'll probably lean more towards China. Other Southeast Asian countries like the Philippines are going to lean more towards the U.S. because they're a treaty ally, and they have that dispute in the South China Sea. But this is just one example, I think, of the U.S. trying to use force to prevent this from happening through the sanctions, and it backfired. Maybe it made Cambodia, gave them more of a reason to cooperate closely with China. All right, the next one here, the warring sides in Yemen agree on a major prisoner swap. So the Houthis and the Saudi-backed Yemeni government have agreed on a prisoner swap that will release over 800 detainees after the two sides held 10 days of talks in Geneva, Switzerland. So the Houthis said that they agreed to release 181 prisoners, including 15 Saudis and 3 Sudanese. In exchange, the Saudi-backed government will release 706 people. So that's a lot. And this deal was brokered by the UN and the International Committee of the Red Cross. So the prisoner swap comes as the Saudis and the Houthis are engaged in separate negotiations that are being mediated by Oman to bring an end to the war in Yemen. So Hans Grundberg, who's the UN Special Envoy for Yemen, he said that the prisoner exchange deal was another sign that things are moving in the right direction when it comes to ending the war. And of course, Grundberg also welcomed the surprise deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, saying that it's a new momentum in the region to bring about an end to this war in Yemen. And where we're at right now, the Saudis and the Houthis agreed to a ceasefire at the end of March 2022. And that lasted until October 2022. The truce has expired, but since then, there's still been no recorded Saudi airstrikes in Yemen, and there's been no Houthi attacks inside Saudi Arabia. So that's huge. It's been over almost a year now that's been holding. So that's really great. And the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition has eased the blockade. They haven't fully lifted the blockade, but they have eased it. So things are definitely a lot better for people in Yemen than they were a year ago. They still need to, finish this and make a real deal here so this thing doesn't escalate, because it could escalate at any moment. And actually, this Saturday, March 25th, will mark the 8th anniversary of the Saudi-led coalition intervening in Yemen to fight against the Houthis. With the full backing of the Obama administration, I linked to their National Security Council putting out a press release about supporting this war on March 25th, 2015. Excuse me. And since then, the war has killed at least 377,000 people. More than half of them have died due to the starvation and disease caused by the blockade and the coalition's brutal bombing tactics. So it's just a brutal, brutal war. More than half the people that have died are also children under the age of 5, because, of course, the most vulnerable are the ones who are dying in these when there's all these food shortages and just disease going around. So hopefully, there's a lot of signs that a deal is coming soon, but hopefully we see it and they ink something and it really puts an end to this thing. All right, the last one here. Bezalel Smotrich, everybody's favorite Israeli MK, says that there's no such thing as Palestinians. So this is Israel's finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich. He's part of this new, Netanyahu coalition. He's one of the extremist settlers, who, favors annexing the West Bank. And he's the finance minister, but he's also a minister within the defense ministry. And he's basically now the de facto governor, how Haaretz put it, of the West Bank. And he can, approve settlement construction and really expand Israeli settlements in the West Bank. So anyway, on Sunday at a memorial service for a late Likud activist in Paris, he said, quote, "There's no such thing as Palestinians because there's no such thing as Palestinian people," end quote. He claimed that the Palestinians were an invention cooked up in the 20th century to fight Zionism, and that it was people like him and his grandparents who were the real Palestinians. So, this is kind of a talking point that you see from a lot of these guys, even though of course, for hundreds of years and, before, Palestinians were a people and it was an area. So I just figured, I would highlight this because this is the kind of rhetoric that's coming from this new Netanyahu government. And he also, at this event that he spoke at, they showed a map of what they call, I think, Greater Israel, which includes parts of Syria and Lebanon and regions, maybe in Jordan as well, that these ultra Zionists, want Israel to expand into those regions. And I think he got, the government in Jordan wasn't happy about that. So anyway, that's it for the news stories for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from James Carden over at Responsible Statecraft. Progressive restrainers join the war party. Oh, sorry, that's over at The American Conservative. We have one from William J. Astore, learning little from the Iraq War. One from Colonel Ann Wright, don't let the media cheerlead the U.S. into more wars like it did in Iraq. And she actually resigned 20 years ago. She was in the State Department. She resigned from the U.S. government in protest over the invasion of Iraq in March 2003. And she says she does not regret it one bit. One from Quinn Marshik, Asia is none of NATO's business. That's over at Nikkei Asia. And one from Responsible Statecraft, aside from Bush and Cheney, who is at fault for the Iraq war? And it's a collection of people that were around at the time opposing this thing, and the people that they've named besides, the obvious ones that they think were responsible. And Scott Horton, our editorial director, is in there, and he says David Wormser. So go check all that stuff out. And that's it for me for today. You could always support the show at antiwar.com/donate. Tell people about the show, like and subscribe on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey. Download it wherever you listen to podcasts. You can leave ratings and reviews over there. I appreciate those. I appreciate all the YouTube comments and the Rumble comments. It's all good stuff. But that's it. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.